So I'll start with the first 20 minutes and then hand over with HIV and health stuff and hand over to Eric for 20 minutes for the laboratory component of our collaborative work. And then we'll circle back to me to talk about the genocide is the way that we've kind of set this up. So the first part is about HIV, family planning, and tropical disease research. These are pictures of the mountain gorillas in Rwanda. And I'll start with an overview of the funding that is available for the kind of work that we do. So on the left side is a list by amount of money, a ranked list of the donors. So the United States, because we're big and have a huge economy, is in the Western countries, the biggest donor in terms of dollars. However, we are 19th in the right-hand column in terms of the percent of our GDP that our global development funding constitutes. Number one is Sweden, Norway, as you might expect. It's always the Scandinavian countries. So I'll be talking about kind of from 30,000 feet on down. So there's health versus other development issues in Africa. Within health, there's HIV versus the other kinds of problems that they face. Within HIV, there's always this tension between focus on prevention versus focus on treatment. And since the work that we do is on prevention, there's also comparing one prevention strategy to another. This is from a website which is now under construction. It was taken offline during the Trump administration. Now it basically, if you go to it, it says we're building. So they're trying to put it back. But the distribution of this funding hasn't really changed so much. This is from 2011. Of the funding that the US gives, the two big chunks are for health and for peace and security. Within health, historically, since 2004, when the Bush administration founded what they call the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was essentially new money. It was not taking money out of an existing pot for development. It was adding new money specifically for HIV. And he named an ambassador to run this, and the first ambassador he named had been the CEO of Eli Lilly. So as you might imagine, the focus was very much on drugs. But that did create new funding. And because HIV was predominantly in Africa at the time, and still has its outside effect in Africa, that's where much of the money is going. But in comparison, if you look, for example, at family planning and reproductive health and water and sanitation, which are two topics that I'm going to come back to, the amount of funding that's available for those two very important things is just dwarfed by the amount of HIV funding. One thing that has been really at the forefront of our work is family planning, and that's because the average African woman, even now, after years of family planning support, the average African woman has more than 5 children. In comparison, other, let's call them less developed continents or countries, Central and South America, Asia, not counting China, but let's say India and Southeast Asia, they've brought down their total fertility rate, which is the average number of women a child has in her lifetime, to somewhere around 2.5 or less. So Africa is the only remaining continent that continues to have this barreling population growth. And you can see here from 1950, which is the first time there was a census done, until 2020, that there has been a steady, and very steep increase in population. In fact, the population's grown 268% since the HIV epidemic was recognized. That's a problem for poverty because household size is one of the major 4 drivers of poverty. It's also led to a lot of environmental degradation and conflict over limited resources. So the work on family planning that we've done has been motivated essentially by this. The 2 countries that we've worked in are called Rwanda and Zambia. And Zambia down here is in Southern Africa. Rwanda is much smaller, little tiny, it's the size of the state of Maryland, in fact, and it's right there in Central Africa. They're very different. Historically, Rwanda was a Belgian colony. They also have different clades or subtypes of HIV virus. Rwanda is predominantly clade A and Zambia is clade C. Zambia was a former British colony. predominantly English speaking. Interestingly, although Zambia has 15 times the surface area of Rwanda, the populations are about the same. So Zambia has about 17 million people, Rwanda about 15 million. So Rwanda is the most densely populated country in Africa. People are just packed in. Whereas in Zambia, they're spread out. And in fact, Rwanda has one language which everyone speaks. The communications are thus very straightforward. There's good infrastructure, good roads. You can get the message out, everybody understands it. Zambia has 5 major language groups and 73 dialects, and they also have terrible roads and infrastructure. So getting anything going from a health program point of view is much more challenging in Zambia compared with Rwanda. So the basic principle of our work with HIV and sexually transmitted diseases and family planning is that it takes 2 to tango and to transmit. Knowledge is key. So 75% of African adults are married. Half of HIV positive married adults have HIV negative spouses, and we refer to this as a discordant couple. But 85% of these discordant couples don't know that they have discordant test results, and thus they don't take steps to prevent transmission. Through our US government programming, 40 million pregnant women have been tested for HIV, but tested without their partners. So the majority now of new infections that are happening in babies are happening because the mom was infected during pregnancy because her husband was HIV positive and neither of them knew it. And this is something we've been working on for a long time. So we do couples voluntary counseling and testing, the rationale being that you make a risk reduction plan based on the combination of results. So if both partners are HIV negative, then the focus is on preventing either partner bringing in HIV from an outside partner. If they're both HIV positive, the focus is on referral for treatment and also prevention of opportunistic infections and sexually transmitted infections, as well as unplanned pregnancies. If one partner is positive and the other is negative, this is where we really have an opportunity to prevent HIV transmission. When both partners know both results, they know what they need to do and they're motivated to do it. So there's been a lot of myths about couples testing and counseling over the years that have made it very difficult to disseminate and implement. One is that it's too difficult or expensive to get couples to come and get tested together. Another is that they won't agree. They'll insist on being tested separately, or if they do agree, they won't change their behavior, even if they know their joint serostatus. You can counsel men and women separately and it works just as well. So if you tell her she's negative and you tell him he's positive, they'll go home and hash out their prevention plan at home, which does not work. And then, very importantly, talk to the coordinator. I'm the PI or the sponsor or the thought leader, and I'm just far too important to be involved with this kind of trivia. So, and shouldn't someone else be doing this? So I think because the president's emergency plan was started with such a drug focus, anything that has been frontline public health prevention that doesn't involve drugs has basically been ignored. And there's also been a lot of, I think people tend to really underestimate Africans, and they think that they're not capable of acting on important information, and that's just not true. So we've developed a prevention package for HIV, unplanned pregnancy, and other common causes of death. And we have shown through nationalizing couples testing in Rwanda, which is still the only African country that's done so, and testing about 300,000 couples in 6 cities in Zambia and following them up, that new infections are reduced by 2/3 when you test both couples with 2 negative partners and couples with 1 negative and 1 positive partner, just by telling them their test results, not counting any drug influence, you reduce new infections by 2/3. If we also offer family planning at the same time when we're talking to the couples about their HIV test results, we reduce unplanned pregnancies by 50%. So a major part of the work that we've done on that is with long-acting reversible contraceptives, the IUD and the contraceptive implant. So the IUD that's available in Africa is the copper IUD. It's been around a long, long time. It went in the 70s. It was very, very popular. And then it gained a reputation for causing pelvic inflammatory disease and fell off the radar for a while. Now it's back with a new design, a new shape, much more focus on local disinfection before you insert. It has to go, you do have to do a speculum exam and insert it in through the cervix into the uterus. So it does call for some technical expertise and, you know, a gynecologic exam bed and a speculum and an autoclave and all those things. But the IUD costs 62 cents, and as long as you leave it in, it can prevent pregnancy for up to 12 years. So it's without any hormones, which is, you know, good for a lot of women. So it's no surprise that it's actually the most popular contraceptive method used by gynecologists and the wives of gynecologists here in the United States. But in Africa, it's basically not available unless a program like ours goes in and trains the nurses and educates the couples and so forth. The contraceptive implant is now 1 or 2 match-sized sticks that go under the skin of the arm. And those last either 3 or 5 years, depending on whether you use 1 stick or 2. Those do use hormones, and they have hormonal side effects, just like all hormones do, but they are generally tolerable, and you know, women appreciate them. The nice thing about talking to husbands and wives together about this is that one of the common things that you'd hear when you talk to women about family planning is, well, I would need to talk with my husband about this and make sure that he's okay with it. What is not the case is that men are forcing their wives to have a lot of babies, or anymore that women want a lot of babies. So it's a bit like we're all of a certain age. My parents' generation, my stepdad came from a family of 11, you know, Italian, Irish Catholics. He had 4 and I had 2. And that's just in a couple of generations. And I think a lot of us probably have those family histories. The same is true in Africa. Many of the doctors that I work with their parents came from very large families. They themselves have had far fewer children, and their children will have fewer children. So our experience with counseling couples about family planning together is that the men are just as enthusiastic about being able to control fertility as the women. They generally agree. There is no, you know, the woman wants to have a baby and the man doesn't want her to. Those things happen very, very infrequently. So generally speaking, and the men also like the new technology. So when you show them the IUD, you know, it's just this big, or the contraceptive implant, and you tell them how long it lasts, their wife is not going to have to come to the clinic every 3 months to get her shot or to pick up more pills. They're very excited and interested. So in Zambia, in our program that tested 300,000 couples, the government clinic nurses also inserted 90,000 IUD and implant. So just to show how popular it is if you do the services right. We also provide a basic package of health services that costs less than $2, and that includes a little box of chlorine, a little bottle, sorry, of liquid chlorine. And this is because there are cholera outbreaks in the urban areas in Zambia about every 3 years. The water is contaminated, and when cholera breaks out, it just spreads like wildfire through the city. It's not chlorinated water, and people don't know how to use chlorine to make their own household water potable. So a little bottle of chlorine costs 30 cents. It lasts a household for about a year. And we've shown that by, you know, educating them about it and showing them exactly how to prepare it, they will use it, and it does work. We've also done, of course, especially now with COVID, talks about hand washing and sanitation. We screen for schistosomiasis and for hypertension and diabetes. So in comparison, treating one person with antiretrovirals for HIV costs $400 per year. The other thing, and Eric will speak more to this at the molecular level, is that genital inflammation and ulceration are also really important, and that's regardless of the cause. So there are sexually transmitted infections, but there are also causes of genital inflammation that are not sexually transmitted. So for example, yeast infections or bacterial vaginosis. All of those things cause inflammation, attract inflammatory cells to the area, which are the target cells for HIV. And having these ulcerations and inflammation facilitates transmission of HIV, both from man to woman and from woman to man. And it's true for both the HIV positive and the HIV negative partners. So these abnormalities make people more contagious and more vulnerable to HIV, whether they're men or women. So this has been a focus of our research as well. I'll skip that one. So I'll talk a little bit about how we publicize our couples programs. This is Ubumibwesu, which is the Bemba language in the northern part of Zambia, our testing center. Couples come in, they participate in a group session initially, which is based on a video that's made in the language that's locally spoken. Then there's a group discussion, question and answer. So group programs are far more efficient, especially if you're going to transplant these services into government health centers, which we have been doing for years. You need something that is reproducible, hence the video. So the message is the same every time. It does not cost a lot of money, and doing it in a group context also normalizes the discussion. Then the couples go in together with a counselor and ask whatever remaining questions they have. If they make a decision to get HIV tested, they have their blood drawn. These days, we can actually do the test with a finger stick. These are the rapid tests for HIV. They take about 10 minutes to develop. If the first test is positive, then there's a second confirmatory test that's done. And over in this corner here, what you see is syphilis tests. So while we're doing HIV testing, we also do syphilis testing. And there's still quite a lot of syphilis. In fact, when in the 90s, when we moved from Rwanda to Zambia, syphilis was killing more babies than HIV. So it's an important add-on. We also provide childcare, because if both the husband and the wife are going to be with us for a few hours for this process, and we do it all in one day. So they get the pre-test counseling, the rapid HIV test, and the post-test counseling. And we've got childcare minders to take care of their kids. So one aspect of this is demand creation or publicity, if you will. And this is a graph that shows how many couples came in to get tested when the CDC funded us. The CDC and later the Canadian, the British governments funded us to implement HIV testing in Zambia. So we had performance-based pay for promotional agents. So these were influential people in the neighborhoods that we would recruit and train to go out and talk to couples about getting tested for HIV together and distribute these written invitations. And anytime a couple would come in to the center, whether they chose to get tested or not after counseling, that promotional agent would then be paid. So they were paid based on their success with being convincing to couples that this was worth taking time on the weekend. The other thing we started doing, because in Zambia, as I mentioned, it's very big and spread out, and the cost of fuel, because it's landlocked, is very high. So getting from A to B costs money. So we began to offer transport reimbursement to couples, and that again added to the number of couples that came in. Then at some point, somebody at CDC said, oh no, you can't do, this is not legitimate. You're not supposed to be publicizing this. You're not supposed to be incentivizing it. And so they banned us from doing any promotions or reimbursing transport, and the numbers went down again. And so we stepwise, added them back in and showed that basically both things were critical. If you have to have community-based promotions, especially in a country with 73 different languages, you can't use the radio stations, and you have to offset the costs that the out-of-pocket costs for people to come and get tested at your center. Check my time here. Okay. So couples voluntary counseling and testing, we've done a lot of work on the cost effectiveness of this, particularly as it relates to the cost effectiveness of other ways of preventing HIV. And we've shown that in Zambia and in modeling in 8 other countries, we chose countries from West Africa, Southern, Central, and East Africa that had enough data from demographic and health surveys and salary costs and that kind of thing for us to be able to model. And what we found is that the cost of preventing one HIV infection through couples voluntary counseling and testing is about $500 a year. Now, the next step, and that's if you assume the infections are only reduced by 50%. In fact, they're reduced by 2/3, so the cost is less. But we've always had to be very conservative in our publications because there's just so much pushback against this concept that something could be so cheap, easy, and effective and not involve drugs. So then if you treat the HIV positive partners in discordant couples, and that concept has gotten a lot of promotion, you will further reduce transmission by making the HIV positive partner less contagious. But every infection you prevent with those drugs costs $9,000 a year. So yes, treating people with antiretrovirals does make them less contagious. It's also very expensive. It's not the least expensive way to prevent HIV. So we've been, trying to get people to kind of compare, because in this climate, there's going to be rationing. Even when the budget was $9 billion a year for this global HIV program, there was still rationing. Now it's down to $6 billion. So the rationing is even worse. So, we have to be able to say, okay, male circumcision reduces likelihood of HIV transmission at a cost of X. Preventing transmission from mother to baby using drugs, you can prevent an infant infection at the cost of Y. There was a really successful intervention that was done in Zimbabwe, giving households enough money so that their teenage girls could stay in school. So if the teenage girl stayed in school, the household received money. And that reduced new HIV infections in teenage girls by 75%. So, and it was very affordable. So there are lots of interventions out there that do not involve drugs, that are affordable and sustainable in the local context, and that have a lot of other benefits. So for example, couples HIV testing can be combined with family planning and with screening and treatment of sexually transmitted infections. Keeping girls in school has lots of benefits beyond HIV. So this is the perspective that we've tried to encourage. Okay, so that's it for me for the first 20 minutes. I'm going to hand over to Eric, and I'll see you again in 20 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the transmission and pathogenesis of HIV, and the lessons we've learned from these African couples that Susan has been recruiting and counseling and following for a number of years. Let's see. Oh, there we go. See if I go back. There we go. So as Susan said, most of the work that I'm going to be talking about today refers to work we've done with samples from Lusaka in Zambia, but we've also worked as well as at the Copper Belt up here. And this just shows two sites that, they're NGOs, they're not in university facilities, but they are, the labs themselves have been certified to be effective, good laboratory practice. And in fact, we're some of the first labs in Africa to be certified in that way. Just a little bit of background. In 1996, I was director of the Center for AIDS Research in UAB. I'd been on sabbatical for a year. I came back. Susan had been recruited to UAB, and in midsummer, she said, I'm having some political problems in Zambia, and I would really appreciate it if you would come and just talk to the people there and give me some sort of political support. And I said, well, I'm really not sure. And she said, well, I've already asked two of the physicians, senior physicians in the center, and they can't come, so I really would like you to come. And I wasn't terribly enthusiastic, and it turned out that the time she wanted me there, I was supposed to give a talk in Germany, and I said, I would do it, but I'm giving a talk in Germany around that time. And she looked at me and she said, perfect, you're halfway there. And so that was my that was my introduction to work in Zambia. And after a week, we really found that we worked incredibly well together and have been together pretty much ever since. So, but what was very clear was that by studying discordant couples, as Susan called them, you know, and these aren't couples that can't get on, right? These are couples that are discordant for HIV testing. And by studying them, we really have the opportunity to look at the virology of HIV transmission. And we can analyze the viruses both in the transmitting partner as well as the newly infected partner, and we call them donors and recipients, in a way that would not be possible otherwise. And as Susan mentioned, by couples counseling and testing, you can reduce transmission by more than 2/3. I think some of the recent data would suggest it's maybe even 3/4. And that obviously that's incredibly effective because circumcision only works in men, and it's around the similar sort of level. This works for both the women and the men. But it's not zero transmission. And that means that because we were following these negative partners initially every 3 months and then every month, we could immediately know when transmission had occurred. And we could then define where that virus came from by using basically fingerprinting the virus and showing that in about 75 to 80% of cases, the negative partner that became newly infected had received their virus from their partner. And that meant that we could look at the virus in the transmitting partner and compare it to the virus in the newly infected partner and learn something about the qualities and some of the aspects of transmission that were related to the virus. And the first thing that we found, and you can see we've been working on this now for 17 years, was that while there was a very diverse population of viruses in the chronically infected partner, we call this a viral quasi-species. These are very closely related to one another, but very distinguishable using molecular tools. That despite that variety in the chronically infected partner, 80 to 90% of the time, a single genetic variant was transmitted. And so that said that there was this incredible genetic bottleneck that the virus was going through. And basically, it was a single virus establishing infection in the newly infected individual. Now, that's 80 to 90% of the time. But depending on the route of transmission and the prevalence, as Susan mentioned, of genital ulcers and genital inflammation, a proportion of transmissions involve multiple variants, usually 2 or 3 or 4. And those are coming from the same partner at the same time during that unprotected sex act. So when we look at HIV transmission, we know that it has both stochastic and selective components. You know, the role of chance is there because the transmitted variant, this one virus that gets through, has to be located within the genital tract. It has to interact with genital or rectal mucosa because we see this in MSM transmissions as well. It has to somehow cross the epithelial barrier and find a susceptible target cell. And then there has to be a sufficient number of secondary target cells for infection to spread and establish first a localized and then a systemic infection. So there's a lot of chance going on here for any one virus in the population. But it turns out that there is a selective component to this. And when we compared what we call the transmitted founder virus, the single virus that gets transmitted, in the transmitting partner to the viruses in the transmitting partner, we found that they represent represented more ancestral viruses. They looked more like the very virus that had infected that chronically infected partner, or at least what we would have speculated it would be, rather than one that had evolved in the host, because HIV does evolve in a chronically infected individual. In fact, it evolves more than influenza does during a pandemic. And this was the first evidence really that we had for a real selection bias during transmission. Two really interesting things came from this, though. One was selection bias. This selection for more ancestral viruses was much stronger when we were looking at transmission from women to healthy men. That is, men are harder to infect than women. And therefore, because the virus has to be, because the selection for the virus is stronger, the viruses are fitter for transmission when they go to from a woman to a man. But interestingly, again, getting back to this whole idea of genital inflammation, men that had genital inflammation actually had a lower barrier to infection and a selection bias very similar to women. And that suggested that the mucosal barrier itself was contributing to the selection of more ancestral viral variants. So what we think is happening here, and let me just see if I can use a laser pointer here, is that multiple viruses are actually are being exposed at the genital mucosa, but only a few of them get through. And some of them, despite the fact that they can get into the target cell, which is a cell we call the CD4 T cell. It's a lymphocyte that expresses certain surface components that the virus needs to enter that cell and then start reproducing. So even though there might be a susceptible target cell, if a virus isn't fit enough for transmission, it may not be able to get beyond that cell. On the other hand, you might have a virus that's fit for transmission, but it actually gets into a cell that's not yet activated and is not yet capable of producing more virus. And so there is this competition between viruses, and only a few viruses, we believe, have the ability not only to get into a susceptible target cell, but to reproduce at a level in those cells to spread the infection initially locally and then further on. In contrast, if there's an infection, let's say a herpes virus infection or some yeast infection, there's more likely to be breakage of the epithelial layer. There's already activation of immune cells in the region with incoming cells that are activated and are therefore perfect targets for transmission. And so that's the reason we believe that multiple viruses actually evolve from instances where transmission occurs in a person with genital inflammation. So I mentioned that we were able to identify newly infected individuals, and some of these individuals were really very close to the time of transmission. But we also, through some funding from the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, as part of their Protocol C study, we were able to follow up newly infected partner for up to 8 years. And we were able to measure how many of these susceptible, these potential targets, the CD4 T cells, were present in the blood, because what we know is that those cells decline over time as the virus basically wipes them out. So we were able to do longitudinal CD4 counts, as we call it. And we were also able to look at the levels of circulating virus in the blood, and we call that viral load. And so we were able to get these measures of disease progression ongoing. And of course, this work started in 2005. It was before there were access to antiretroviral drugs. And it really wasn't until about 2012 when antiretroviral drugs became widely available. And at that point in time, we basically stopped following discordant couples. So it allowed us to analyze the impact of immune selection in the donor, the impact of the immune system of the chronically infected person on virus reproducibility, the way the virus could replicate or reproduce. And we could also look at disease progression in the recipient for more than 5 years, up to 8 years. So the first thing we found really that was quite unexpected was the rate with which the transmitted virus can reproduce. We call it the viral replicative capacity. The rate with which it reproduces can influence the rate of CD4 T cell decline. So in other words, the rate with which disease progression occurs. And when we looked at over 127 viruses derived from newly infected individuals, and so you can see the power of being able to follow discordant couples and identify newly infected individuals, it was unbelievable. We found that their replicative capacities were sort of generally showing what we would call a Poisson or a normal distribution. Some were rather poor at replicating, some were very good at replicating, and there was quite a lot in the middle. So we divided these 127 into groups of 40, and we asked, what does this mean in terms of disease progression? And what we found, if I can just get this to move forward, there we go, was something quite striking. So viruses in this first tercile, as we call it, the first third, the poorest replicating viruses, actually caused a relative slow decline in CD4s. What we're asking here is, most people, healthy people, have around what we call a CD4 count of about 1,000. When you get down to 300 cells, you're very close to developing a lot of the opportunistic infections that are characteristic of AIDS. And so you can see that someone infected with a virus that doesn't replicate very well or doesn't reproduce well in cell culture, those individuals actually survive a lot longer without losing their CD4s, whereas viruses in these two groups cause those patients to lose their CD4s much faster. And in fact, they have to go on ART or on antiretroviral treatment much sooner. So what's the mechanism? Why does viral replicative capacity have such an impact on disease progression? Well, we used a statistical method to ask, well, what are the components? We know that viral load, the amount of circulating virus in the blood, has a major impact on CD4 count loss or CD4 loss. We know there are certain immune genes designated here by this B57, B5801, are more protective. And so they actually decrease the rate at which CD4s are lost. And then here is a virus that's in that lower tercile. And what you can see is the protective effect of this is very similar to the protective effect of what we call protective immune genes. And that was independent because all of these were statistically significant. It was independent of the immune system, and it was independent of the impact of set point viral load, the steady state of virus in the bloodstream. And so it argued that when we look at the process of virus replication, and this just shows what is a sort of standard schema for HIV infection in a newly infected individual, the virus ramps up very, very quickly up to levels of 10 million per teaspoon of blood. And then the immune system kicks in. So we can fight this virus, but the virus never gets to zero. It has this steady state level that we call viral set point. And then as the CD4 counts, these target cells for HIV, decline over time, over years, then the onset of symptoms occurs. And that's when we see opportunistic infections. And that's right around 300 to 200. So it argued to us that whatever the virus replicative capacity was doing was having its effect before the immune system kicked in and before we got to set point viral load. And so what we did find when we looked at this by a number of approaches was that high replicative capacity virus, so that if, by chance you happen to get one of these hot viruses, it was linked to an inflammatory state that was characterized by elevated levels of key inflammatory cytokines that were known to drive the disease progression of HIV. So the virus sets up a state that cannot really be reversed. And part of that is it's associated with an aberrant immune cell response that is both activated and exhausted, that is much less effective at getting rid of the virus. And it's also kills off a lot more T cells. So this work showed us that the replicative capacity of the transmitted founder virus had a major role in defining disease progression. It accelerated CD4 loss by inducing very early in infection in inflammatory state. It drives T cell dysfunction and high infection levels in key memory cells that are important for maintaining the immune system. And it could only be modulated, but not reversed by an effective cellular response. So just to switch topics a little, I'll just repeat salt and peppers. Let's talk about sex, baby. And let's think about the importance of studying HIV disease in women and men, but particularly women, because almost 20 million women are living with HIV. They constitute a little over half of all adults with HIV. In 2018, new infections among young women 15 to 24 years old were higher than among men of the same age group. In sub-Saharan Africa, about 80% of new infections among young people aged 15 to 24 years are in girls, particularly in South Africa. So, and it's the leading cause of death for women of reproductive age globally. We know that women respond differently to infections. They have been shown to exhibit a much more robust immune response to both primary virus infections as well as vaccination. So they can more likely spontaneously clear hepatitis C virus. And antibody responses to influenza, hepatitis B virus, and smallpox vaccines are much higher in women. So women have a better ability to respond to vaccines than men. And we've seen a similar thing with COVID, where men seem to be admitted into hospital and suffer the consequences of that more frequently than men. And there's women, as part of this, have a higher level of what we call immune activation. And that contributes to their increased susceptibility to inflammatory and autoimmune diseases. So autoimmune diseases are more common in women. Now, what we do know is that both genetic and hormonal factors play a role. And in men, androgens are generally anti-inflammatory, whereas estrogens, the female sex hormone, are generally pro-inflammatory and might, in fact, play a role in this increased immune activation. Most studies comparing HIV infection in men and women had been done in chronically infected cohorts. So they were looking relatively late in infection, 1 to 2 years or 3 years after the initial infection event. But in contrast to those studies, the Zambian heterosexual transmission cohort and frequently that was a comparison of sex workers to gay men. So there were some differences in the mode of transmission as well. But the Zambian heterosexual transmission cohort represents both men and women living in the same environment and identified very near the time of HIV infection. So for the first time, we were able to study sex differences in this acute early infection stage. The recruitment of newly infected partner into Protocol C also allowed us to look at this over time. And we could therefore look at the impact of sex. The first thing we found, and this had been seen in chronically infected cohorts, was that men, shown here in blue, have to always have men in blue, right? Have a higher set point viral load than do women. And it's about a 3 to 4-fold higher viral load. And it's there very early in infection, and it stays throughout chronic infection. Women generally have higher levels of CD4s than circulating CD4s than men. It's usually about 200 to 300 cells per cubic millimeter higher than men. And you can see that here. But while men see a relatively slow decline in CD4s over the first 3 years of infection, 2 to 3 years of infection, women show a more rapid loss of CD4s. And this is a conundrum because we normally think that viral load, the amount of virus circulating in the blood, is going to be a primary driver of CD4 loss. And I showed that in that Cox proportional hazard model, that statistical analysis earlier. So why would women lose CD4s faster than men when their viral loads are lower? And it's an observation that really people had observed late in infection, but had not seen from the very beginning and had not been able to really answer. So I just for sake of time, since I'm really running out of time, I'll just summarize what we found so far. And that is, there's a major role of the female sex hormone estrogen in sex differences observed in HIV infection. And this estrogen, or estradiol, which is the major hormone that is involved here, appears to be key to both the faster rate of CD4 decline and lower plasma viral load in women. So I mentioned that during, what we have found is that during this very early stage of HIV infection, those target cells for HIV, the CD4 T cells, in women are more highly activated than those in men. And of course, the more highly activated cells are better target cells for HIV. And yet, that doesn't seem to be reflected in viral load. And what we found is that high estradiol levels in women are linked to this higher CD4 T cell activation, but they're also linked to lower levels of circulating virus. And the reason we think that the latter is the case is that genes related to type 1 interferon signaling pathways, these are molecules that are antiviral molecules, and which can be regulated by estradiol levels, are more highly expressed in the CD4 T cells from acutely infected women than men. And most importantly, the genes that are expressed at higher levels in women and are associated with lower viral load have functions related to interferon signaling, restriction of HIV replication, and immune activation. So estradiol seems to be playing two roles. It's involved in CD4 T cell activation, which results in a higher CD4 T cell decline, but it also suppresses viral replication, both through production of interferons, but also through activation of restriction factors that are known to inhibit HIV replication. So what have we learned? Well, transmission of HIV involves both stochastic and selective processes, and in general, a single virus initiates infection. That despite selection, viruses with a wide range of replicative capacities are transmitted, and that replicative capacity of transmitted virus impacts disease progression in a major way. Men and women display very different trajectories of disease early in infection, HIV infection, and which appears to be driven in large part by the sex hormone estradiol. And so HIV is the result of this complex interplay between viral and host genes and their expressed products. And obviously you can't do any of this without a village. I've had some great postdocs and graduate students in my lab. We couldn't do it at all without our colleagues in Rwanda. And of course, Susan has been a key player in directing this program. And we've had great support from the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, colleagues at Emory, colleagues at other institutions, and some great funding over the years. And I'll stop there.
So the 1994 genocide in Rwanda took place over about 100 days. It was organized by the then government with the participation of the military, paramilitary, civil service, and community leaders, including religious leaders. 1 million people were killed in 100 days, mostly the Tutsi ethnic group and moderate Hutu who did not support the genocide ideology. It was stopped by rebel forces headed by children of refugees from previous genocides. So the two ethnic groups had conflict before, once in 1959 through 1962, which was concurring with independence from Belgium, once again in 1972-73. So 1994 was, the next iteration of what had happened before. This is a memorial to the members of my staff that perished in the genocide. Every April 7th, which is the day the genocide began, there is a commemoration of genocide events. I have to say, I had 62 staff working for the project the day the genocide began. Half died or disappeared, and some we still don't know what happened to them. So many people died with their entire families, leaving no one to report the death. And that's something that has troubled many families in Rwanda. So we have been working on chasing genocide planners and organizers. I'll tell you about what happened to us in Zambia. But first, just to kind of get a general idea of how well organized this was, Rwanda itself is a very organized country. It's kind of the Switzerland of Africa. And each 10 to 50 houses has a government assigned minder that basically keeps track of what's going on. It can be good. They keep track of whether they're poor and need help with food or housing. It keeps track of whether they're going for their vaccinations, taking their children for vaccinations and so forth. But it's also an existing politico-administrative infrastructure through which orders can be given. And so in this kind of setting, you can sort of think of it as how many perpetrators were on the front lines wielding machetes and actually murdering. And then each of them, let's say, was responsible for one death, which is not the way it worked. They killed in groups, but just for the sake of simplicity. And this number of perpetrators is actually a CIA estimate. So 852,000 people, according to the CIA, are estimated to have participated in the killings at some level. So let's say you have 700,000 people on the front lines. Each 10 of them reports to someone. So that's 70,000 low-level leaders, each of whom 10 of whom report up, and so on. And you end up then with the very top level of planners and organizers. And actually, they were a team of almost 20. But if you think of it that way, then the higher up you are on the perpetrator chain, the more victims you're responsible for. And you would have to then decide at what level do you, as an American, care about pursuing a perpetrator who's living in the United States? Do you care if it's one of the 700,000 who are at the lowest level? Do you only care if it was an individual, let's say, sort of theoretically responsible for 10 deaths or 100 or 1,000? At what point is this someone who's worth the effort? And this is an argument I've been trying to make to the authorities in the United States for years. And I've met every 3 years I go up and I meet, because there's a lot of turnover. I meet with people in Department of Justice, Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The State Department has a war crimes unit. And I try to bring them all together and get them to talk. And then I go to the Hill and I lobby senators and congressmen. I tell them, these are the people living in your state or your district. And here is a human rights investigation of what they are alleged to have done. So, each time I speak with the authorities, they say, oh, even if they killed only one person, that is enough for us. That's still a killer. And problem is, that's not the actions that you see happening. So I think this is similar to, Nazis who fled after the Holocaust. It's similar to justice after the Cambodian genocide, which generally has been lacking. And even for Bosnia, they've struggled to get even the high level perpetrators, much less the lower level ones. So Rwanda is not unique in this regard, but it is pretty frustrating when you've got, I know personally right now, I just got an updated list when I was in Rwanda last month of about 14 people who I would say were in this 700, where you were each responsible for 1,000 deaths or more. That are living in the United States. The Rwandan government has reported them to Interpol, has asked the United States to hand them over. They are known, and nothing's happening. So it's really very, very frustrating. So far, the U.S. has sent one person to the International Criminal Tribunal, and 5 people, 5 Rwandans have been deported directly to Rwanda. But, when you consider how many of them are out there. So the International Criminal Tribunal was set up for the former Yugoslavia, and then they kind of grandfathered Rwanda in when the genocide happened. They spent $1.5 billion prosecuting fewer than 40 genocide perpetrators. So it's a very high-level symbolic thing, but it doesn't have any real traction in terms of justice on a larger scale. So the first 3 that were handed over by an African country to the International Criminal Tribunal were handed over from Zambia. And it was because when we fled Rwanda, we went to Zambia because we had contacts there. We started putting peppy announcements on the radio. We kept our same name. We registered as a non-governmental organization called Project San Francisco. We got on the radio with announcements about come get tested with your spouse. We do couples testing and counseling. And it turned out a whole bunch, the genocidal government was overthrown and the leaders fled to surrounding countries. A number of them ended up in Zambia. When they heard that we were there, and there were 6 of us expatriates, so that had come from Rwanda, and we brought 9 Rwandan families with us from our staff. And when they heard these announcements on the radio, they realized, oh, there are people here in Zambia now who know who we are and who might denounce us to the government here. So they threatened to kill us. And so we called the authorities, and we called our embassies. We had a Belgian guy and a German woman, and I have dual citizenship with the Republic of Ireland and the U.S., and so I called those 2 embassies, and that's essentially how Zambia became the first African country to hand over Rwandan genocide perpetrators to the International Criminal Tribunal. And that was a seminal event because the ICTR at that point had not established jurisdiction. It was a new thing. And a lot of African countries were saying, well, where's the legal framework that enables us to hand these people over to you? And it basically just took one country to say, hey, you know, these guys have threatened to kill people in our country. We've rounded them up, come and get them. And the embassies helped. The intelligence and immigration authorities in Zambia were very aggressive about rounding these guys up. And then obviously they started communicating because the International Criminal Tribunal was not responding. They were in their period of reflection, where they had not yet indicted anyone. And so the fact that an African country had arrested people that the Rwandan government had identified and human rights organizations had identified as perpetrators wasn't enough to move the needle at the ICTR until negotiations, bilateral negotiations directly between Zambia and Rwanda were moving ahead. And I managed to get a price quote from an Irish private plane company that, usually did tours, safari tours and this kind of stuff, that they were willing to fly these guys directly from Zambia to Rwanda as long as they were shackled and there were guards. And we had a price quote, $27,000. We were ready to go. And then the ICTR realized, oh no, if this precedent is established of African countries handing people directly over to Rwanda, then we'll be completely irrelevant. So we better take action on this. So the Zambian government had arrested 11 people. The ICTR eventually said, okay, wait, we'll take some of these guys. They indicted 3. And so we said, fine, you take the 3, the remaining 8 sent to Rwanda. And the ICTR said, no, make them comfortable in Zambia. We'll continue to investigate them and we'll come back for them later. Well, they never did do that. And 4 of those people ended up in the US, where we then had to hunt them down here and spend lots and lots of money because they have, the exiles have a lot of money and they get lawyers and it's very difficult. And in the long run, one guy died in the US before he could be deported, after Homeland Security had sent 3 different teams of investigators to Rwanda to collect evidence. And we've had, I think, a total of 5 guys deported. They use the deportation mechanism because there isn't an extradition agreement between the US and Rwanda. And if you can get somebody who is not yet a US citizen, and you can prove that they lied on their paperwork when they came in. You ask these questions about where did you participate in the genocide? Were you involved in the militia or the military, blah, blah, blah. And of course they say no. And if you can prove that that's a lie, that's enough to deport them. And that's where these 5 that have been deported to Rwanda have come from. There have been a couple of court cases for people who managed to become US citizens. At that point, Department of Justice has to deal with them. They have to be de-citizenized first before they can be deported. And one of those cases sort of blew up because the prosecution didn't do a very good job and the defense had one of the 10 best defense lawyers in the country. And the guy was 84 and the US government just didn't have the stomach to try him again. The other one, and also 2, have spent time in US prisons before being deported to Rwanda. One guy bit the arresting officer, the arresting US officer, spent 4 years in a US jail for assaulting an officer and then went to Rwanda. And then a woman spent several years for fraud in a prison in Boston and then was just deported last year to Rwanda. So, there's a few, but not enough. And just to give you a very brief idea of what the rest of the world is doing, there are different legal systems have different options. Some countries have actually prosecuted these people for genocide in their own country and imprisoned them in their own country. So that includes Belgium, Germany, the UK, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. UK had a very, very widely publicized case with 4 guys. And they were just on the cusp of being sent back to Rwanda. And because Rwanda was not yet part of the Commonwealth, it is now a part of the Commonwealth, but their lawyers managed to argue that they could not be deported to Rwanda and they were released. So they're still free in the UK. But these others are either in jail in that country or they've been sent back to Rwanda. the one thing that's complicated all this is that before 9/11, 2001, Department of Justice essentially handled all these kinds of cases, whether they were citizens or non-citizens. Once Homeland Security was created, they started what the old Nazi hunters in DOJ, who were the people I initially worked with, then had to split their responsibilities with the people at Homeland Security. So Homeland Security essentially took over people who had not yet become citizens. They were green card holders or visitors or students or whatever they were. And then DOJ would take care of the ones that had become citizens. And that led to, you know, the more US government agencies you have involved, the more confusing things get. People don't communicate, the duplication of effort. And so it's been, you know, and now it's been, you know, so many years that there's not a lot of appetite, really. If it's an administrative removal, if it can be done easily with, you know, yeah, the guy lied, it's very straightforward, let's put him on a plane, then that's easier to do. But one of the guys of the 14 that I just mentioned is very, very high up in the Southern Baptist Church hierarchy. And he is protected. The ones that are in the religious sector are the ones that are the most protected, because they're, whether they're Catholic or Adventist or with this guy Baptist, they, you know, those churches protect them just the way they protect pedophiles. So it's very hard to get to those people. And here's the ICE page for the human rights violators. And that's it. All right, thank you.
Thank you. We'll move to questions.
First, Susan, I want to say that you are my hero for your preventive work, which I had hoped, I had wished to be a part of at some time after I left Angola in 1984. I have a question there about whether there was any continued activity in the existing health branches, local or national, of your counseling project, or if it was isolated to what you were, what the organization was doing.
Well, we did provide, you know, oddly, I'm having trouble seeing the guests, but that's okay. Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you.
Okay, good enough. So, so we did have a grant from the CDC for about 3 years to train people from 22 other African countries to provide, to target couples, basically, both with family planning and HIV prevention. And we did demonstration projects in those countries showing that it was feasible to do in, you know, every context that we attempted. The problem was we could never get funding. And so without the funding to do the demand creation and the training and to provide additional staff to provide the service, because health centers are just chronically understaffed anyway,
right.
It was just never able to take off. So that's really the only issue, was the money.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Andy?
That's to Eric. Very interesting, both of you. I wondered about the CD4 in women and men, whether this occurs with tuberculosis or corona, for instance. As I mentioned, why I'm interested, because when the HIV occurs and it's not treated, the CD4 goes down. That's obvious. So the question I have is, does it go down faster or less with men or women? And then, because I cannot do anything now with corona, but I'm interested about the same issue, what happens with people who have HIV and corona in relation to the CD4.
Yeah, so in women, the women lose their CD4s faster immediately after infection. It's about a little over twice the rate of CD4 decline that we see in men. And we attribute that to the increased activation of CD4s in women. In fact, we can see a relationship between activation and the rate of CD4 loss. Andy, I think there's quite a few people starting to look at HIV and corona. I don't know any data on what it does to CD4 loss. As far as I've seen so far, individuals with HIV have not had worse coronavirus infections than uninfected individuals. So the disease severity does not seem to be any worse. But there've been secondary impacts of COVID. And that has been, the difficulty of people getting in for medical care, the disruption of the medical system. And so it's been more of an impact on people's HIV care, I think, than the actual impact of HIV on COVID disease, on the SARS-CoV-2 disease.
Sorry, before I didn't mention that the interest I have about it now is tuberculosis, because HIV will make people with tuberculosis get much worse because of their CD4. Does that happen with women with HIV? So in that situation, is the man or the woman different? And if they are, who gets what early and late?
Yeah, I don't have any data on tuberculosis and sex differences in tuberculosis in the context of HIV-1, Andy, and I haven't seen any studies that have, I think the sex differences in disease is still relatively understudied, and I think it's there is an interest in following this up now in a number of areas, but I think it's been relatively understudied, and in part because it's quite difficult in HIV to have comparable cohorts.
Well, maybe I'll call you later. Thanks a lot.
Larry Vogler has his hand up.
Yes, hi. I have two related questions. Eric mentioned the effect of female hormones on, higher CD4 counts and viral replication. I was wondering if those women who have choose to use the implants for family planning are more susceptible to infection because of that. And the second question is, are those couples that use IUDs or implants less likely to use condoms and then maybe have an increased risk for transmission?
So the discordant couples, we have not noticed any increase in transmission related to hormonal contraceptive use of any kind once you correct for exposures, which you can pretty accurately do in discordant couples. And that's what makes our cohorts so different from others. Because if you just look at a bunch of HIV negative women and, some use hormone contraceptions, some don't. What you can't account for is the confounding, they may have sex with a person every day who is HIV negative. So it doesn't matter if they're using hormones. And that dilutes your ability in a cohort study to really tease out whether hormones are related to HIV transmission or not. In our setting, when you know that they're having sex with someone who has HIV, and they're keeping a diary, a coital log of exposures, which isn't perfect, but which is better than not knowing who they're having sex with. We don't find any association between HIV transmission and hormonal contraceptive use. And we don't see any association between contraceptive use of any kind, IUD, implants, depot, and condom use. So they don't decrease their condom use when they start an effective contraceptive method.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, got lots of questions, but let me start with one. I'm wondering what the situation is at this point with babies being born to infected mothers, or perhaps to a discordant couple where the mother is not infected, the father is, and being, brought home to that household. How are things going with babies and their susceptibility to HIV?
Well, if you have a known HIV infected mother, the drug regimen that you give her is essentially the same drug regimen that she's getting because she has HIV, and it also prevents transmission to her baby. The danger to the babies is HIV negative mothers who don't know that their partner has HIV.
Oh, yeah.
And that about 5% of mothers per pregnancy in Zambia in these cities are seroconverting. So they're between the first time they come in for antenatal care and when they come in to deliver, 5% of them have acquired HIV.
Wow.
And that's because the husbands aren't being tested.
Now, are babies routinely tested as soon as they're born?
If the mother is known to be positive, yes. But the mother's only tested at her first antenatal visit and when she comes in for delivery.
Mm-hmm.
So by then it's basically, it's too late, right?
And if a baby is infected, how's treatment for the tiny ones?
It's harder to get. It's more expensive. It has to be made in a syrup formula. And I know one of the people we've been working with for a long time is a pediatrician and neonatologist, and she's worked very, very hard to get, the low cost generic versions of these drugs made in pediatric formulation. It's been hard to get attention because what everybody's been trying to do is to prevent the babies from getting infected. And then without testing the husbands, you're still getting infected babies, but it's people say, oh, we don't have to worry about that because, now we're treating the moms and there's no more transmission. So on a limited basis, there is a syrup-based antiretroviral therapy available for babies.
And a related question, to what extent does religious belief maybe impact their willingness to adopt family planning techniques? I mean, is there any pushback from some of the religions practiced? And I'm thinking, well,
we just published a paper about this, interestingly. So Rwanda used to be very Catholic before the genocide. The new regime now has, with the diaspora coming back from all over the world, has brought with it lots of new evangelical religions. So the Catholics, of course, institutionally wouldn't allow contraceptives. They controlled a lot of the health centers and they wouldn't allow contraceptives to be given in those health centers. So the government had to set up these sort of little health posts. Now that's no longer the case. The government is much stronger in their position of, and Zambia also is very pro-family planning. So even though it's a very, very devout country, primarily Protestant, lots of different denominations, at an institutional level, now there isn't really, the churches don't have the kind of voice that they used to. And at the individual level, Catholic ladies in Rwanda are actually more likely to uptake a long-acting contraceptive method than non-Catholics. So whatever is being said in the church about this is not affecting their personal decisions.
Right.
The Muslims are a small group in both of the countries I work in, and they have tended to be very receptive, actually.
Okay, right. Is that paper out already or soon?
Yeah, I can send you a copy. Yeah.
Well, or the information, we can put a link in the newsletter.
Yeah. Putting a link in the newsletter, I think, would be great. James Keller, you have your hand up.
Yes, you had alluded to the fact that there's a trial going on with an HIV vaccine. Can you say anything about those vaccines in relationship to the developments of the ones we've had with COVID? In other words, are they messenger RNA or are they virus?
Eric,
can you
want
hear
to take
me?
that one?
Yeah, so there is, so the one that we're looking at in Zambia is made by J&J, and it uses the same crippled cold virus as does the J&J COVID vaccine. So at least one arm, one part of the vaccine is a virus called adenovirus 26. And that virus has been sort of made crippled, so it doesn't cause any disease, but it does code for the proteins of HIV or of coronavirus. So there is a commonality there between the two. RNA vaccines have not really broken into the HIV vaccine area. The few studies that have been done have not been spectacular in the same way that the coronavirus vaccines have been. And I think in part that's because HIV is a much tougher target for the vaccine. You know, our bodies had never seen coronavirus, and coronavirus had never seen our bodies. So the vaccines had an easier time, I would say, with inactivating coronavirus. HIV has been in people for probably 100 years, maybe a little longer, and it is a chronic disease, so it has learned to adapt to our immune systems. So it's a much more difficult target to develop a vaccine against.
Okay, Andy?
It's Susan again. I have a genocide question to Susan. Do you think that the recent admission of France's involvement in the genocide will in any way affect the continued hunt of the perpetrators?
I hope so. It certainly will improve relations between Rwanda and France. And they did just arrest, France just arrested a guy who was actually one of the top 10 that was wanted by the International Criminal Tribunal. He's, I think, 84. And he had been living in Kenya for a long time, and he had extensive plastic surgery to change his face. So it made him difficult to track, but they did find him and they have arrested him in France just in the last few months. So now what they're going to do with him, I don't know. But at least they've detained him.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks.